The worst betrayals do not always begin with lies. Sometimes they begin with a beautifully wrapped gift sitting beneath a Christmas tree. Every year, my husband Michael and I hosted Christmas Eve at our home. It had become a tradition during our 9 years of marriage. His family would arrive in the afternoon carrying casseroles, desserts, and enough holiday decorations to make our living room look like something from a magazine. By sunset, the house would be filled with laughter, familiar stories, and the smell of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh-baked cookies. For most people, it was the perfect family gathering. For me, it had always been slightly more complicated. Michael loved his mother, Diane. There was nothing wrong with that. I loved my own parents too. The problem was that sometimes it felt as though Michael never stopped being Diane's son long enough to become fully my husband. Over the years, I had learned to ignore the small things. If Diane wanted to choose the restaurant for a family celebration, Michael agreed. If Diane preferred a certain vacation plan, Michael found a way to make it happen. If Diane needed help with something, Michael dropped everything to be there. None of those things seemed serious enough to argue about individually. Yet together they formed a pattern that quietly followed us through our marriage. Still, I entered that Christmas feeling hopeful. A few weeks earlier, Michael had started acting differently. Not distant. Secretive. Several times I had caught him quickly closing browser windows when I entered the room. Twice I noticed shopping bags hidden in the trunk of his car. Whenever I asked questions, he smiled and said the same thing. Just wait until Christmas. The excitement in his voice made me smile every time. One evening while we were decorating the tree, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders and said, "This year is going to be special." I remember looking up at him and believing every word. Life had been busy. Work had been stressful. We had both spent months juggling responsibilities and family obligations. A thoughtful surprise felt like exactly what we needed. As Christmas Eve approached, my anticipation grew. Michael dropped hints constantly. He mentioned how long he had spent searching. He joked that he almost could not keep the secret any longer. Once I even spotted a small luxury store bag hidden inside our guest room closet before he quickly moved it elsewhere. The glimpse lasted only a second, but it was enough to make me curious. More importantly, it made me feel seen. It felt as though he had invested genuine effort into finding something meaningful. On the morning of Christmas Eve, I woke up happier than I had been in months. Snow covered the neighborhood. Holiday music played softly throughout the house. Michael seemed unusually cheerful as he helped prepare for the family gathering. Several times I caught him glancing toward the large collection of wrapped presents beneath the tree. Every time he did, a small smile appeared on his face. By late afternoon, family members began arriving. Diane entered first, as she often did. She carried a tray of homemade cookies and immediately started directing activity in the kitchen. Michael greeted her with a warm hug. The two of them shared a private conversation that I could not hear. When I walked into the room, they stopped talking. Neither seemed uncomfortable. Yet something about the moment stayed with me. As the evening continued, more relatives filled the house. The atmosphere was festive and loud. People exchanged gifts, shared memories, and enjoyed dinner together. Several times I noticed Michael checking the clock. He looked excited, almost nervous. Finally, after dessert, someone suggested it was time to open presents. Everyone gathered around the tree. Cameras appeared. Children moved closer to the front. Wrapping paper soon covered the floor as gifts changed hands. Throughout it all, I kept waiting for the moment Michael had promised. Then I noticed one final gift remaining beneath the tree. It was larger than the others and wrapped in elegant silver paper. Michael picked it up and held it carefully in his hands. The smile on his face instantly made my heart race. For weeks, he had been building anticipation around this surprise. For weeks, I had believed that gift was meant for me. What happened next would change far more than Christmas. For a brief moment, I smiled. The silver wrapping paper reflected the Christmas lights, and the entire room seemed to fade into the background. I was certain this was the surprise Michael had been talking about for weeks. He stood beside the tree holding the gift carefully, almost proudly. Several relatives turned toward him with curiosity. Even Diane looked interested. Michael cleared his throat and smiled. "I have been excited about this one." My heart immediately sped up. I glanced around the room and noticed a few people looking at me expectantly. They probably assumed the same thing I did. After all, Michael had spent weeks hinting about a special surprise. Then he turned toward Diane. "Mom, this is for you." For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard him. The room remained cheerful. Nobody seemed shocked. Nobody looked confused. Only me. Michael stepped forward and placed the gift into Diane's hands. Applause immediately followed. Several relatives smiled. One of Michael's cousins even joked that Diane was clearly the favorite. Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. Diane looked genuinely surprised. "Michael, you did not have to do this." "I wanted to," he replied warmly. I sat frozen on the couch. The smile I had been wearing moments earlier disappeared so quickly that my face almost hurt. My mind raced through every conversation we had shared over the previous month. Every secretive smile. Every hint. Every promise that Christmas would be special. Every hidden shopping bag. Every mysterious comment. Suddenly all of those moments looked completely different. Diane carefully opened the wrapping paper while the family watched. Inside was a beautiful designer handbag from an expensive luxury brand. I recognized it immediately. Not because I owned one. Because I had admired one in a store window months earlier. Michael had been standing beside me that day. I remember pointing toward it and laughing about how it was far beyond anything I would ever spend on myself. At the time, Michael had simply smiled. Now I was staring at that same handbag sitting in Diane's lap. My stomach dropped. Diane gasped when she saw it. "Oh my goodness." She ran her fingers across the leather with obvious excitement. "Michael, this is beautiful." More compliments followed. Family members gathered around to admire it. Cameras came out. Photos were taken. Everyone seemed thrilled. Meanwhile, I sat quietly trying to understand what had just happened. Eventually, Michael glanced toward me. "Pretty nice, right?" The question stunned me. Not because he asked it. Because he genuinely seemed to expect me to be excited. I forced a small smile. "It is very nice." The answer sounded distant even to my own ears. If Michael noticed, he gave no indication. The evening continued. More gifts were opened. More laughter filled the room. Yet everything felt different now. I found myself watching Michael and Diane more closely than ever before. Every interaction seemed to highlight something I had spent years trying to ignore. Diane wanted attention. Michael gave it. Diane wanted praise. Michael provided it. Diane wanted to be the center of the room. Somehow she always became it. An hour later, while relatives gathered in the kitchen for coffee and dessert, I stepped onto the back patio for air. Snow covered the yard. The cold night felt refreshing against my face. I stood there alone for several minutes replaying the evening over and over. Eventually the sliding door opened behind me. It was Michael. "There you are." He smiled as though nothing unusual had happened. "Everyone is wondering where you went." I looked at him carefully. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "The gift." His smile widened. "Mom loved it." The answer immediately hurt more than I expected. I noticed. Michael seemed confused by my tone. "What is wrong?" I stared at him in disbelief. "You really do not understand?" For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. He hesitated. "Rachel, it was just a Christmas present. Just a Christmas present." Hearing those words felt like someone quietly closing a door. Not because of the handbag itself. Because of what it represented. The promises. The expectations. The fact that somehow, once again, I had ended up standing behind Diane. What Michael did not realize was that this Christmas gift was about to force me to confront a question I had avoided for almost a decade. Had I spent 9 years competing with his mother for a place in my own marriage without ever realizing I was losing? The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled when people spoke to me. I helped clean dishes. I refilled coffee cups and carried dessert plates back to the kitchen. From the outside, I probably looked perfectly normal. Inside, however, something had shifted. Michael's words repeated endlessly in my mind. It was just a Christmas present. The more I thought about that statement, the less accurate it felt. If it had truly been just a present, I would not have been standing alone on the patio questioning 9 years of marriage. Around midnight, after the last relatives left and the house finally became quiet, Michael and I began cleaning the living room. Torn wrapping paper still covered parts of the floor. Christmas music played softly through a speaker in the corner. Normally, this was one of my favorite parts of the holiday. The calm after the celebration. This year felt different. Michael seemed completely relaxed. He hummed along with the music while gathering empty glasses. Finally, I could not hold my thoughts any longer. "Can we talk?" He looked up. "Sure." I sat on the couch and waited until he joined me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me for hours. "Why did you spend weeks making me think that gift was for me?" Confusion immediately appeared on his face. "I did not." I stared at him. "Michael, you absolutely did." "Rachel, I never said the gift was for you." Technically, he was right. He had never directly said it. Instead, he had allowed me to believe it. The distinction irritated me more than I expected. "You knew exactly what I thought." He looked away. That single reaction told me everything. "I guess I can see how you got that impression," he admitted. "Then why not correct me?" Michael sighed heavily. "Because I did not think it mattered." The answer landed harder than the gift itself. Not because it was cruel. Because it sounded honest. He truly had not thought it mattered. Look down at my hands. Do you realize how that felt? "Rachel, you are making this bigger than it needs to be." There it was again. Dismissal. Minimization. The same pattern that had followed us for years. Suddenly memories began surfacing. Moments I had excused. Moments I had explained away. Moments that looked very different now. I remembered our third wedding anniversary when Michael canceled our dinner plans because Diane wanted help reorganizing her garage. I remembered a beach vacation where Diane somehow ended up joining us for 4 of the 7 days. I remembered countless holidays where her preferences quietly became everyone's plans. Each event seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. "Do you know what hurts the most?" I asked quietly. Michael crossed his arms. "What?" "You never even considered how I would feel." His expression softened slightly. "That is not true." "Then tell me you thought about it." Silence. The absence of an answer said more than any explanation could. Eventually Michael stood. "I think you are tired." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because I recognized the strategy. If a conversation became uncomfortable, Michael often treated it as temporary emotion rather than a legitimate concern. "Maybe," I replied. "Or maybe I am finally paying attention." The conversation ended shortly afterward. Neither of us wanted an argument on Christmas Eve. Yet the distance between us felt larger than ever. The following morning I woke up before sunrise. The house remained silent. Snow still covered the neighborhood outside. Unable to sleep, I made coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table. As I stared at the Christmas tree glowing softly in the darkness, I found myself thinking less about the handbag and more about the pattern behind it. That was when something unexpected happened. My phone vibrated. A text message appeared from an unfamiliar number. First I assumed it was spam. Then I opened it. The message contained only a single sentence. "Rachel, if you really want to understand why Michael always puts Diane first, you need to learn what happened 20 years ago." I read the message 3 times. No name. No explanation. Nothing else. Just those words. And for the first time since Christmas Eve began, I realized the story behind the gift might be far bigger than I ever imagined. I stared at the message for several minutes. The coffee beside me slowly cooled while dozens of possibilities raced through my mind. 20 years ago. The phrase repeated itself over and over. Michael was 38. 20 years ago, he would have been 18. Old enough to remember something significant. Old enough for an event to shape the rest of his life. What I could not understand was who had sent the message. I checked the number again. Nothing looked familiar. No name appeared. No previous conversations existed. Just a single sentence that had somehow transformed my entire morning. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Anonymous messages rarely led anywhere good. Another part of me could not stop thinking about it. If the message was meaningless, it was oddly specific. If it was true, then someone outside our immediate household knew exactly why Michael treated Diane differently. Later that morning, Michael joined me in the kitchen. He looked rested. I looked exhausted. He immediately noticed. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. "Not much." He poured himself coffee and sat across from me. Neither of us mentioned the conversation from the previous night. The silence felt deliberate, almost protective. Eventually Michael checked his phone and smiled. Mom loves the handbag. There it was again. The gift. The same gift that had somehow become the center of every thought in my head. I watched him carefully. Michael, can I ask you something? He nodded. Sure. Has there ever been a reason you felt responsible for Diane? The question seemed harmless. Yet his reaction was immediate. His shoulders stiffened slightly. The change lasted only a second, but I noticed it. What do you mean? He asked. Just curious. He looked away toward the window. Not really. The answer came too quickly. Almost rehearsed. A strange feeling settled over me. For years I had known this man better than anyone. Suddenly I was not sure that was true. The remainder of Christmas Day passed quietly. By evening, I still could not stop thinking about the anonymous text. Finally, I made a decision. I replied, "Who is this?" Hours passed without a response. I began assuming I would never hear from the sender again. Then shortly before 10 o'clock that night, my phone vibrated. The reply contained only a location and a time. Corner Cafe. Monday, 2 p.m. No name. No explanation. My pulse immediately quickened. Every instinct told me this was a bad idea. Yet curiosity proved stronger than caution. The following afternoon, I arrived at the small cafe 10 minutes early. Snow lined the sidewalks outside. The holiday rush had faded, leaving the restaurant unusually quiet. I ordered coffee and chose a table near the window. At exactly 2 o'clock, the front door opened. The person who entered shocked me. It was Michael's Aunt Carol, Diane's older sister. She spotted me immediately and walked over carrying a serious expression. "Thank you for coming," she said. I stared at her in disbelief. "You sent the message?" She nodded. I did. Aunt Carol had always been one of the quieter members of the family. Friendly, polite, never dramatic. If she was involved, then whatever this was had to be important. She sat down and wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee. For a moment, she simply looked at me. Then she sighed. "I have spent years wondering if someone should tell you." My heart began racing again. "Tell me what?" Aunt Carol glanced toward the window before answering. "Michael believes he owes his mother everything." The statement sounded strange but not entirely surprising. Why? Carol's expression softened. Because 20 years ago, Diane sacrificed something very important for him. I waited. What happened? She hesitated. That is the problem. Her voice lowered. The story Michael believes and the story that actually happened are not necessarily the same thing. Every nerve in my body seemed to wake up at once. What does that mean? Carol reached into her purse and carefully removed an old photograph. Then she placed it on the table between us. I looked down. The image showed Diane standing beside a man I had never seen before. They appeared younger, happier, and written across the back of the photograph was a date from 20 years ago, and a sentence that immediately changed everything. Because the name written beneath the picture was not Michael's father. Aunt Carol watched my reaction carefully as I stared at the photograph. The man standing beside Diane was smiling with an arm around her shoulders. They looked comfortable together. Familiar. Like people who had built a life side by side. Yet I had never seen him before. Who is he? I asked quietly. Carol folded her hands together. His name was Richard Bennett. I turned the photograph over again. The date written on the back matched the year Michael had graduated from high school. 20 years earlier. The same period mentioned in the anonymous message. I do not understand, I admitted. What does this have to do with Michael? Carol took a deep breath before answering. Everything. The word hung between us. After Diane's husband passed away, she struggled financially for several years. Raising Michael alone was difficult. Richard came into her life during that period. I listened carefully. The story itself did not sound unusual. Many people rebuilt their lives after loss. What mattered was why nobody had ever mentioned Richard. Carol continued. For nearly 3 years, Richard and Diane planned to get married. My eyes widened. Married? Carol nodded. Michael was close to him too. Closer than most people realize. Suddenly the photograph made more sense. This was not some casual relationship. This man had once been part of the family. A significant part. What happened? I asked. Carol looked down at her coffee. That depends on who you ask. The answer immediately reminded me of something she had said earlier. The story Michael believes and the story that actually happened are not necessarily the same thing. I leaned forward. Tell me. Carol hesitated for several seconds. Then she finally spoke. Michael believes Diane sacrificed her future for him. I frowned. Meaning? He believes Richard wanted Diane to move away after they married. Michael did not want to leave his friends or his school. According to Diane, she ended the relationship because she chose her son over her own happiness.
He said silently.
The story sounded powerful. Emotional. Exactly the kind of sacrifice that could create lifelong loyalty. If Michael believed his mother had given up her chance at happiness for him, it would explain a great deal. It would explain the guilt, the devotion, the constant need to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid. Yet Carol was looking at me with an expression that suggested the story was incomplete. But, I asked. Carol sighed. But that is not what happened. My pulse quickened. Then what did happen? She reached into her purse again and removed several folded papers. They looked old, carefully preserved. She slid them across the table toward me. A few years ago, I found these while helping clean out my parents' attic. I unfolded the first page. It was a letter. Richard's name appeared at the bottom. I began reading. Within seconds, I realized something was wrong. Very wrong. The contents directly contradicted Diane's version of events. According to the letter, Richard never asked Diane to move away. In fact, he had offered to relocate closer to Michael's college so they could remain near him. The proposal sounded thoughtful and generous. Nothing like the ultimatum Diane had apparently described over the years. I looked up in disbelief. Michael has never seen this? Carol shook her head. No. Did Diane? Another pause. Then Carol nodded. I believe she did. The room suddenly felt smaller. If Diane had seen the letter, then she knew the truth. More importantly, she knew Michael's understanding of the situation was built on something entirely different. Carol lowered her voice. Richard ended the relationship for reasons Michael never learned. What reasons? I asked. Carol looked genuinely uncomfortable. That is the part nobody talks about. She pointed toward another document in the stack. Read the second page. Slowly I unfolded it. At first glance it appeared to be a financial statement. Then I noticed several highlighted entries. Large amounts of money. Transfers. Dates. Names. My confusion deepened. What am I looking at? Carol answered quietly. The reason. Richard left. I scanned the page again. Then I saw Diane's name connected to a transaction that immediately caught my attention. The amount was larger than anything I expected. Far too large to ignore. And according to the date on the document, it had occurred only weeks before Richard disappeared from the family forever. I stared at the financial statement while questions piled up faster than answers. The highlighted transaction showed a payment that would have been significant even today. 20 years ago, it represented an enormous amount of money. Diane's name appeared beside it. So did Richard's. I looked up at Aunt Carol. What exactly happened? Carol glanced around the cafe before lowering her voice. Richard loaned Diane money. That answer surprised me. A loan. She nodded. A large one. I looked back down at the document. Suddenly the timeline started forming a shape. Diane was struggling financially after her husband's death. Richard entered her life. They planned to marry. Money became involved. Then everything fell apart. Did she repay it? I asked. Carol hesitated. The pause itself felt like an answer. Not completely. My stomach tightened. And Michael never knew? No. Carol shook her head. As far as Michael knows, Richard left because Diane chose her son over a new marriage. He spent 20 years believing his mother sacrificed her happiness for him. I sat back in my chair. Everything I had learned over the previous 48 hours seemed to connect at once. The excessive loyalty, the guilt, the constant need to put Diane first. Michael had built his entire understanding of that period around a story that portrayed his mother as selfless. If that story was incomplete, then his behavior suddenly looked very different. Why would Diane hide this? I asked. Carol sighed. Because the truth is complicated. She looked genuinely sad. Richard was not angry about the money itself. He was hurt because Diane never told him the full extent of her financial problems before they became engaged. I stared at the documents again. Trust. Secrets. Misunderstandings. The themes sounded painfully familiar. What happened after he left? Carol asked. Michael became convinced his mother had given up everything for him. Diane never corrected that belief. Eventually it became part of the family's history. I understood now why Carol had reached out. This was not really about old financial records. It was about a narrative that had shaped Michael's entire adult life. Before leaving, Carol handed me copies of the documents. I am not asking you to confront anyone, she said. I just think you deserve to understand what may be driving all of this. I drove home in silence. Snow lined the roads. Christmas decorations still glowed on porches throughout the neighborhood. Normally I love this time of year. That afternoon my mind was too occupied to notice any of it. When I arrived home, Michael was working in his office. He smiled when I entered. How was your afternoon? The question sounded so ordinary. Yet suddenly I found myself studying him differently. For years I had assumed he consciously chose Diane over me. Now I wondered if something deeper was happening. What if he was not acting out of preference? What if he was acting out of obligation? A debt he believed could never be repaid. That evening after dinner, Michael stepped into the shower. His phone remained on the kitchen counter beside me. I had never searched through his messages before. The idea made me uncomfortable. Yet another thought bothered me more. What if there were pieces of the story I still did not understand? After several minutes of internal debate, I picked up the phone. I was not looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I was looking for context. Almost immediately, I found something unexpected. A recent conversation between Michael and Diane. Most of the messages were harmless. Then one exchange caught my attention. It had occurred 3 days before Christmas. Diane had written, "You do not have to keep proving yourself after all these years." Michael's reply appeared seconds later. "Yes, I do. I owe you everything." I stared at the screen. There it was. In his own words. Not affection. Not favoritism. Debt. Guilt. Obligation. Diane responded with a single sentence. One that immediately made my heart race. "Then promise me you will never tell Rachel about Richard." I read the message again. Then again. My pulse thundered in my ears. Because whatever Michael believed about the past, Diane clearly feared that I might learn the truth. And judging by that message, Michael knew far more about Richard than anyone had admitted. I barely slept that night. The message exchange between Michael and Diane replayed endlessly in my mind. "Promise me you will never tell Rachel about Richard." Those words changed everything. Until that moment, I had assumed Michael was simply unaware of the full story. Now I knew he was actively protecting part of it. The question was why. The following morning Michael left early for work. As soon as he pulled out of the driveway, I opened the folder Aunt Carol had given me and reviewed every document again. The financial records. The letters. The photograph. Each piece seemed important, yet I still felt as though something was missing. Then I noticed a handwritten note attached to one of the copies. I had overlooked it before. The note contained a law office name and an attorney's signature. Curiosity immediately took over. After a few phone calls, I learned the attorney had retired years earlier. However, his former partner still managed many archived records. By that afternoon, I found myself sitting across from a woman named Susan Walker inside a small office downtown. I explained that I was researching family history. I did not mention the conflict. I simply asked whether any records related to Richard Bennett remained on file. Susan listened carefully before disappearing into a storage room. 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a thin folder. "Most of these records are public," she explained. "Nothing confidential." My pulse quickened as she placed the folder in front of me. Inside were copies of property documents, correspondence, and legal notes connected to Richard's estate planning. One page immediately caught my attention. Richard had drafted a will shortly before ending his relationship with Diane. I scanned the document. Then I froze. Michael's name appeared multiple times. Not as a casual mention. As a beneficiary. My heart nearly stopped. Richard had planned to leave Michael a substantial college fund, additional educational assistance, even future financial support. The amount was significant. More importantly, the document included a handwritten note from Richard himself. Michael is a good young man. I hope he never believes any of this was his fault. I stared at the sentence for several seconds. Suddenly everything shifted. Richard had not blamed Michael. He had not left because of Michael. He had cared about him deeply. The entire foundation of the story Michael believed began collapsing before my eyes. Susan noticed my reaction. "Are you all right?" I nodded slowly. "I think so." But the truth was that I felt stunned. According to every document I had seen, Richard never abandoned Diane because of Michael. He never demanded she choose between them. In fact, he seemed committed to helping both of them build a future together. When I returned home that evening, Michael was already there. He sat in the living room reading. For several minutes, I watched him from the hallway. He looked exactly the same as he always had. Yet now I understood that much of his adult life had been built around a misunderstanding. Or perhaps a lie. Finally, I sat down across from him. "Can I ask you something?" He lowered his book. "Sure." I took a breath. "What do you remember about Richard Bennett?" The reaction was immediate. His entire expression changed. The color seemed to drain from his face. "Why are you asking about him?" I held his gaze. "Because I think there are things I do not know." Michael looked away. Silence stretched between us. Then he sighed. "Mom told me he left because of me." There it was. The belief that had shaped everything. "What exactly did she tell you?" I asked. Michael stared at the floor. "That she had a chance to start over. A chance to be happy. But Richard wanted them to move away. I refused. She chose me instead." His voice softened. "She gave up her future because of me." Hearing him say the words out loud was heartbreaking. Not because I believed them. Because I finally understood how much guilt he carried. Michael continued. "After that, I promised myself I would never let her sacrifice something important again." Suddenly the handbag made perfect sense. So did countless other decisions throughout our marriage. Michael was not trying to choose Diane over me. He was trying to repay a debt he believed he owed. A debt that may never have existed. I looked at him carefully. What if the story was not true? Michael immediately shook his head. "It is true." His answer came too fast. Too defensively. I reached into my bag and slowly removed Richard's handwritten note. Then I placed it on the table between us. As Michael began reading, I watched his expression change. Confusion. Shock. Disbelief. And finally something I had never seen before. Doubt. Because for the first time in 20 years, Michael was being forced to consider the possibility that the story he built his life around might not be the truth at all. Michael read the note 3 times before setting it down. The room remained completely silent. I could almost see the conflict happening behind his eyes. For 20 years, he had carried a story that explained everything. His loyalty to Diane. His guilt. His constant need to put her first. Now that story was beginning to crack. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked. "From records connected to Richard." Michael rubbed his forehead and leaned back in his chair. "There has to be another explanation." The response did not surprise me. When a belief becomes part of someone's identity, letting go of it is never easy. "Maybe there is," I said carefully. "But do not you think we should find out?" He stared at the note again. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain about something involving his mother. The following day passed quietly. Michael barely spoke during breakfast. He seemed distracted throughout the evening. Several times I caught him staring at old family photographs hanging in the hallway. Once, I found him sitting alone in the den holding a picture from his high school graduation. Diane stood beside him smiling proudly. Looking at the image now, I realized how deeply she had shaped his understanding of the world. Late that night, Michael walked into the kitchen where I was reading. I called my mother. I looked up. And he exhaled slowly. I asked her about Richard. My pulse quickened. What did she say? Michael hesitated. At first she got angry. That answer felt predictable. Then she asked if we could come over tomorrow. The next afternoon we drove to Diane's house. The entire trip felt tense. Neither of us knew what would happen. The closer we got, the quieter Michael became. When we arrived, Diane opened the door almost immediately. One look at her face told me she already knew this conversation could not be avoided any longer. We sat around her dining room table, the same table where countless family gatherings had taken place over the years. Diane folded her hands together and looked at Michael. "How much do you know?" she asked softly. Michael placed Richard's note on the table. Diane's expression changed the instant she saw it. Not anger, not surprise, recognition. She had seen it before. "Mom," Michael said quietly, "did Richard really leave because of me?" The question hung in the air. Diane closed her eyes. For several seconds nobody spoke. Finally she opened them again. They were filled with tears. "No." One word. 20 years of assumptions shattered in an instant. Michael stared at her. "What?" Diane's voice trembled. "No. Richard did not leave because of you." Silence followed. The confession seemed to drain the energy from the room. Michael looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Diane continued. "I told myself I was protecting you." Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks. "You blamed yourself for everything when you were younger. After Richard left, I could not bear the idea of you thinking it was connected to financial problems or mistakes I made." Michael shook his head slowly. "So you lied." Diane looked devastated. At first it was only a simpler explanation. Then years passed. The story became easier to repeat than the truth. I watched Michael carefully. The anger I expected never appeared. Instead I saw heartbreak. Not because Diane had hidden something, because he suddenly realized how many major decisions in his life had been built on that hidden truth. "I spent 20 years trying to repay you," he said quietly. Diane began crying harder. "I know." Michael looked down at the table. "I thought you gave up your future because of me." Diane reached for his hand. "I loved you. That part was always true." He did not pull away. But neither did he squeeze her hand back. The room remained heavy with emotion. Finally I spoke. Michael was carrying a debt that never belonged to him. Diane lowered her eyes. "I know." Another long silence followed. Then Michael asked the question that mattered most. "Why did you tell me not to tell Rachel about Richard?" Diane looked toward me. Her expression carried years of regret. "Because I was afraid that once the truth came out, you would finally stop putting me first." The honesty stunned all three of us. Yet in that moment, everything suddenly made sense. The gift, the guilt, the years of imbalance, the secrets. For the first time, nobody was hiding behind old stories anymore. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, Michael was finally seeing his relationship with Diane exactly as it had always been. 3 months later, the Christmas tree was gone. The snow had melted, and life looked very different from the way it had on that December night. Some changes happened quickly. Others took time. But for the first time since I married Michael, our relationship felt balanced in a way it never had before. The transformation did not happen because Diane disappeared from our lives. It happened because the truth finally replaced guilt. During the weeks following our conversation at Diane's house, Michael spent a great deal of time reflecting on the past. There were difficult discussions,
Emotional moments.
long evenings where we talked about things that should have been addressed years earlier. More than once, Michael admitted how strange it felt to realize that many of his choices had been driven by a story that was never entirely true. "I thought I was being a good son," he told me one evening as we sat on the back porch watching the sunset. "You were trying to be a good son," I replied. "There is a difference." He nodded slowly. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be a good husband too." Hearing those words mattered more than any apology could have, because for the first time he fully understood what I had been trying to explain for years. The issue had never been Diane herself. The issue was that guilt had occupied a space in our marriage that should have belonged to partnership. Diane changed as well. Not immediately. Habits formed over decades do not disappear overnight. Yet after the truth came out, something shifted in her. Perhaps carrying a secret for 20 years had exhausted her more than anyone realized. She no longer expected Michael to solve every problem. She stopped inserting herself into decisions that belonged to us. Most importantly, she stopped treating his attention as something she needed to compete for. One afternoon in early spring, Diane invited us to lunch. Halfway through the meal, she surprised both of us. "I owe you an apology," she said, looking directly at me. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. Diane continued. "For years, I allowed Michael to believe something that was not true because it benefited me. And because of that, you paid a price you never should have paid." Her voice trembled slightly. "I am sorry." The apology was simple, honest, long overdue. Yet it carried real weight because it came without excuses. I smiled gently. "Thank you." In that moment, neither of us pretended the past had never happened. We simply acknowledged it and chose to move forward. A few weeks later, Michael and I took a weekend trip together. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet getaway to a lakeside town a few hours away. During our second evening there, we walked along the water as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Suddenly Michael stopped and laughed. "You know something?" I looked at him. "What?" He shook his head. "That handbag may have been the most expensive mistake I ever made." I laughed for the first time about the situation. A genuine laugh. Not because the memory no longer mattered, but because it no longer controlled us. Michael smiled and slipped his hand into mine. "I should have seen what was happening years ago." "Maybe," I said. "But we both see it now." As we continued walking, I realized something important. The real gift that came from this experience was not an object. It was clarity. The truth revealed things that none of us wanted to face. It exposed old fears, old mistakes, and old wounds. Yet it also created something new. Understanding, accountability, growth. By the following Christmas, our family gathering looked remarkably different. Diane still attended. The traditions remained. The food was just as abundant. The laughter was just as loud. Yet one thing had changed forever. Nobody was operating from guilt anymore. As presents were exchanged that year, Michael handed me a small wrapped box. Nothing extravagant. Nothing dramatic. Just a thoughtful gift chosen with care. "This one is definitely yours," he said with a grin. Everyone laughed. Even Diane. Especially Diane. Later that evening, as I watched family members talking around the living room, I thought back to the moment this journey began. A gift. A misunderstanding. A hurt that seemed impossible to explain at the time. What I know now is that sometimes the thing that breaks your heart is not the real problem. Sometimes it is simply the first crack that allows the truth to finally come through. And standing there beside my husband, surrounded by family that no longer needed secrets to stay connected, I realized something I never expected to learn. The most valuable gift anyone can give is not loyalty built on guilt. It is love built on truth.